Okay, this is the second video out of 4 videos on Chapter 27, the Cold War. Last time we left off on analyzing the Truman Doctrine. Now we're going to move on to containment in the 1950s. So in 1947, the National Security Act created the National Security Council and also the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency. And like in modern times, you might know the CIA for doing, undercover secret stuff. But when it was first created, it was made to coordinate with the government and the presidency to perform espionage in foreign lands and to support foreign rebellions on communism. So you can see that Truman is really enacting acts to, aid against their fight against communism. In addition, in 1953, Eisenhower's inaugural address, he details how his administration will be hard against the USSR and any threats of communism. However, Eisenhower does not put this rhetoric into action. He refuses to support East Germans who are revolting against the Soviets. And the same thing in 1956, when the Hungarians were revolting against the USSR, America steps back. As mentioned before, in 1949, there was a shock in the Chinese Revolution. There was a communist takeover. So before 1940, Mao Zedong, the leader of the Communist Party, and Chiang Kai-shek, I know, little word spelling, but Chiang Kai-shek, he was the leader of the Nationalists. They fought in a power struggle over China. In the 1940s, Chiang Kai-shek's party was exhausted and corrupted, and that left China weak during World War II. And Mao Zedong, he won popular support by successfully defending China from the Japanese. In 1949, Kai-shek flees to Taiwan, and China is under control of Zedong and the Communist Party. And when the Communist Party first came into power in China, it openly supports the USSR and denounces the US. And America refuses to acknowledge the new Chinese Republic, and this lasts for more than a decade. In addition, there is more tension in the Asian area. The Korean War through 1950 to 1953 increases those tensions as well and shows another battle against communism that happens. So the stalemate in the Korean War. So in 1945, the Korean Peninsula is freed from Japanese control and is divided at the 38th parallel. You can see that line on the map on the right. North Korea, the part that's in green, fell under the Soviet jurisdiction, and South Korea, the part that's in red, fell under American jurisdiction. In 1950, the North Korean forces invaded South Korea, hoping to unite the peninsula. And you see that on the left side of the picture to the right. You see the red lines show North Korea moving through South Korea, almost taking the whole thing. However, Truman gets approval from the UN and mobilizes American forces led by Douglas MacArthur to defend South Korea. In addition, with UN troops, the American troops, they push North Korea back to the Chinese border. So you can see that here in the second picture, and in the first picture, the blue lines showing all the way to the top. And then in addition, China then retaliates and pushes UN forces back to the 38th parallel. At this time, also, MacArthur is relieved of his duties in 1951 because of insubordination and talking back to Truman. And then, moving on, Eisenhower runs for presidency and insists that he will end the Korean War, and is successful in 1953, where he does end the war. Korean War takes 32,000 American lives, 2 million Korean lives, and the expenditures increased from 13 billion to 47 billion. So again, you can see the increase in defense spending and war spending. In addition to this, there's turbulence in the Middle East. The Middle East remained important to the Allied powers during World War II because of oil and its strategic placement. Allied powers agreed to withdraw 6 months after the war ended, but the USSR refused, and it required US threat to be removed. In 1953, the CIA, again coming back to aid against communism and stuff like that, aids the Iranian army in overthrowing the government so that American and British companies could regain command over the oil. In 1948, also in the Middle East region, Israel is divided for the Jews and the Arabs. The Arabs feel cheated And so they launch an offensive. However, they lose, and in 1949, they give up even more land to the Israelis, to the Jews. American relations with Egypt at the same time was falling through after the military leader Gamal Nasser begins talking with the USSR for financial aid. So the US withdraws support from Egypt, and in 1956, Nasser takes control of the Suez Canal, as you can see on the bottom picture, which disrupts oil exports from Israel, which really infuriates Israel, Britain, and France, who then invade Egypt. And at this time, Eisenhower condemns the attacks because it could push Egypt into Soviet hands, which is something the US is very hard against. And so in 1957, Eisenhower does his own doctrine and declares that the Middle East power vacuum should be filled with the United States influence and not Russian influence. In addition, there is restriction, and there's a restricting revolt in Latin America. So in 1954, the CIA mobilized in Guatemala to overthrow the elected regime that took property from the United Fruit Company. And then Guatemala became a dictatorship that gave land back to the United Fruit Company. So even though America is trying to implement democracy, you can see in Latin America it fails to do so. And what ends up happening is America looks like it's only greed that's motivating them. They only want their companies to succeed. They don't really care about the country. And then in 1959, Fidel Castro overthrows the dictatorship in Cuba and shows a trend of nationalism fighting against oppressive forces. In addition, Castro confiscates American property in Cuba, and so America cuts exports, and Cuba seeks support from the USSR. So, at this time, America and Russia are now at a battle against the bomb. But beforehand, when America only had the bomb, in 1946, Truman considered giving the secret of the atomic bomb to everybody. He proposed an international agency for atomic energy to the UN, but talks with Russia eventually bogged it down. It was left. Later in 1946, Truman approves the Atomic Energy Act, which established the Atomic Energy Commission to supervise atomic workings in the US. And then you see a whole arms race with the nuclear war and nuclear weapons. In 1946, the Americans enjoyed and celebrated the idea of the bomb, mainly because they were the only ones who had that weapon with them. In 1949, the U.S. confirms that the USSR had successfully detonated their own atomic weapon, and then you see a major shift in changes, and that tension that builds with two superpowers having nuclear weapons. In 1950, Truman authorizes construction of a new hydrogen superbomb. In 1953, U.S. and USSR successfully create these hydrogen bombs. And then in 1957, the Soviets successfully launched the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, an ICBM, and they also launched Sputnik into orbit. And you can see this is the beginning of the space race as well. And it shows how these two global superpowers are kind of racing against each other to grow in arms and to even explore areas in space, even though, there's no reason at that point. So continuing with nuclear war and nuclear threats, there's nuclear fallout that becomes a new danger due to excessive bomb testing. In addition, there's new businesses that open that offer fallout shelters, and they become extremely popular due to the threat of nuclear war. And the costs range from about $1,700 to maybe even $3,000. In addition, we have during World War II in addition we have an increase in the amount of bases that have nuclear weapons, and the testing and creation of nuclear weapons in the U.S. So during World War II, the Manhattan Project centers were scattered along the U.S. Hanford, Washington provided fissionable material. Los Alamos, New Mexico became a research and test center. In 1951, the U.S. opens the Nevada test site to the north of Las Vegas, and bombing was so prevalent that the mushroom cloud became a staple of southern Nevada. Missile defense sites were also created in Hawaii and Alaska, showing how there's increased defense spending, and the threat of ICBMs is really growing in the American people. The Boeing company also creates airplanes for dropping nuclear bombs at this time. And then there's this idea of massive retaliation that starts growing. So Truman encouraged the increase of military forces and the nuclear arsenal, but he also strengthened traditional forms of defenses. When Eisenhower came into power, he was a Republican, and he was really working on reducing the amount of federal spending. So he sought to decrease military spending and accomplished this by only focusing on nuclear weapons for defense. His administration created this new idea of massive retaliation against communist threats, and this was basically that the government would threat imminent war, nuclear war, to pressure Soviets and other communist regimes. And this helped him to only focus on increasing the nuclear arsenal and basically leaving the rest of the defense and army behind. There's another atomic protest that happens at this time as well. In 1956, the health dangers of the nuclear war testing or nuclear bomb testing became one of the bases for the presidential candidate Adlai Stevenson, although Eisenhower did not view this in the same way, and in the end, Eisenhower is the one who won that election. In 1957, the National Committee of Sane Nuclear Policy is created and protests against nuclear testing. One symbol they used was the pediatrician Benjamin Spock and the Dr. Spock is Worried campaign. And for a time, the US and USSR listened to these protests, and from 1958 to 1961, they agreed to end testing. But after 1961, you see they start again, and that's when the Dr. Spock is Worried campaign starts. So our second document that we'll be analyzing is the Dr. Spock Sane ad, published in 1962. There's one really big quote that I wanted to focus on. On the bottom, the highlighted one, I am worried not so much about the effect of past tests, but the prospect of endless future ones. As tests multiply, so will the damage to our children, here and around the world. So his warnings reflect the worries of many parents and organizations during World War II, or during the Cold War, who are worried not only because of potential war, but because of the different, radiation and dangerous material that is released through nuclear tests.